Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to our next edition of our guest speaker series here at the Holland Land Office Museum. I am happy to announce that this program is made possible in part through the re-grant program of the New York State Council for the Arts administered by GoArt. So we're very thankful to them for helping support this. This is now the 6th year we've been doing this, and it seems it just keeps going, so I can't turn people away. So we're welcoming back Derek Maxfield tonight. He's been here in the past, but he's back for his new book, Man of Fire, on William Tecumseh Sherman. He's written a book previously, if anybody remembers, coming here and listening to that presentation on Elmira, the Civil War camp in Elmira, New York. But we're happy to have him back and be one of his first stops here for his new book. So we're very thankful for him to be back. So Derek.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm just pleased that you're not so traumatized by the talk I did about Elmira that you would have me back. Many of my students just can't bear it anymore, and just after a couple weeks don't want to hear me talk anymore. So the fact that there are familiar faces, I'm very thankful for. But before I go too far, let me ask you a question. A lot of times when I do book talks, they're to Civil War crowds. And so this is kind of a mixed audience here. How many of you know who William Tecumseh is enough that you could explain it briefly to another person? Okay, all right. That tells me how much detail I need to provide you. Thank you very much. Pablo Picasso famously said that every act of creation is first an act of destruction. It seems well suited to understanding Sherman's Kentucky crisis, which we'll talk more about. There, newspapers and some of his colleagues branded him insane. He was nearly destroyed. But Phoenix-like, he rose from the ashes, created a new military life and reputation. The Battle of Shiloh made Sherman a hero and forced people to reassess their perceptions of the general. And from there, the Ohioan took flight. One of the defining moments of General Sherman's career was a crisis that he had in Kentucky. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to write about the guy. When you write a biography, it's kind of a tricky thing, especially if it's a controversial figure, right? And no biographer sets out to offend people, of course, but if you're a scholar, you want to get it right, and you want to interpret in a way that is, first of all, genuine to the evidence, and then a reflection of your time, right? Because they say that every generation rewrites history. And in many ways it's true, because why would you need another book on Abraham Lincoln after all, right? I mean, there are hundreds. He's the most written about American. Hundreds of different biographies in over 20 different languages, and yet every day it seems like I'm seeing another Lincoln biography. And I'm tempted to buy every single one of them if it wasn't for my wife saying, no, do you really need this one? There's so much room at the inn, right? But biography is something I've always wanted to do. Partly because I love biography. And I think it's a powerful way to learn history and to teach history, focusing on the life of one person or several people in order to learn about a period in time, I think is a better way, because it's more humanizing, to learn our history. And in fact, at some universities, there are whole courses on American history through biography, which I would love to be able to do. But at GCC, that's just not something that students will enroll in, sadly. So I write for you, and I talk for you, and here we are. Sherman, people want to know why Sherman? Why Sherman? And for those of you that don't know much about him, I'll tell you, he's probably one of the most controversial Civil War figures. If you look at William Tecumseh Sherman through the lens of 2023 values, he doesn't look very good indeed, particularly if you're in the woke crowd. The thing is it's a very difficult thing to apply our value system to people that lived at a different time and place. Because you have to remember that society and culture limits them, while at the same time creates unique opportunities for them. And we, after all, know the end of the story, which they don't. Right? And it's not that I'm trying to be an apologist of some kind, because I'm not. I've always been a fan of warts and all history myself. I have this discussion with my students all the time about, for example, I'm teaching the American Revolution in one of my classes right now, and they've been so wrapped up in the whitewashed patriotic version that they get in high school that I have a lot of work that I have to do to try to create a more balanced portrait. You know, thankfully we don't live in a state like Texas or Virginia where they get right down to the names you can say and the names you cannot say in a classroom.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
Sherman, so here's a guy that was very difficult to research in many ways because you love and hate him by turns. You know, there are times when you almost admire him, you know, you're almost there, but then you learn something else and it tears the whole thing down again, and then you have to kind of rebuild, you know. And some of it is just my values here and now clashing with some of the things that he did, right? And I have to remind myself, hey, be careful about that. Be careful about that. On the other hand, racism was a thing at the time of the Civil War. It was, but, you know, just like then and just like now, you had the liberals and you had the conservatives and you had everybody in between, right? And on the issue of race, Sherman was with the middle crowd, he wasn't with the liberals, which sometimes makes him look bad. But then you remind yourself, well, there was another really tall dude that was also quite in the middle when it came to race, and his name was Lincoln, and we remember him pretty damn well, generally, at least in the North. There's some reevaluation going on at the moment, but we don't need to go there. So Sherman is this figure that is so complex, you know? He's just so complex. And that makes him fascinating to me because when I teach history, I want to be able to see the human in the figure, right? I am not the kind of person, I'm not the kind of historian that likes to romanticize anybody. And I remind my students all the time that in America, oftentimes we're told who our heroes ought to be. And that's something that we really need to kind of overcome. Now, I don't know if you know what I mean, but think about it. When you were in grade school, all of you, regardless of age, when you were in grade school, I'm guessing Christopher Columbus was one of the people that you were told should be one of your heroes. Am I right? Yeah, we were told that this is somebody we ought to admire, and we even learned songs about him, didn't we? He sailed the ocean blue in 1492. There's a verse I just sang publicly. Did you get that?
I think you should do it again. So we get the full effect.
Yeah, the problem is I would precipitate a public health emergency, and I'd never be asked back again. So it's one of those things, though, where we're kind of conditioned in a way, and we're told from a young age who our heroes ought to be, right? And then later on in life, hopefully you learn that, hey, wait a second, there's more to the story. Whether it's Christopher Columbus or like the Pilgrims, you know, this is on my mind because I was just out of Plymouth Plantation. And I'm telling my students all the time, these are not people you should really be romanticizing. These people slit throats after all, you know? The Pilgrims are very intolerant people that we should not be romanticizing, you know? So you have to overcome. That's my job. It should be right on my business card. He overcomes. That's why Sherman. Because there is so much interesting about him, even when you hate him. Even when you hate him. In biography, because I said, I think it's a wonderful way to learn our history. Anyway, so the thing about William Tecumseh Sherman is that here is a guy that spent his whole life trying to figure out who he was. And that's part of the story you don't get when you study the Civil War heroes oftentimes, whether it be Grant or Sherman or certainly not Robert E. Lee, another one of those figures that, you know, has been highly romanticized in our history. Sherman had so many insecurities. And when you think about him as a big Union hero, you might not, you know, think that much about something like that. He had so many challenges to overcome. He had so many reasons to doubt himself, even during the war itself when he was flying high. So, for the benefit of those of you who don't really know who he is, so here's a guy that was born in Ohio. He went to West Point. He serves in California during the Mexican War. He doesn't get in any combat. He ends up getting out of the military, becoming a banker, and trying his hand at being a lawyer, and trying this and that. And then he gets to the war, a very dedicated man of the Union. And his challenges in the beginning are so extreme that he very nearly leaves the service. Except the crisis was so great that he couldn't abide sitting at home while the crisis unfolded, right? And so he went on, and he becomes, despite all of these things, a huge hero of the Republic. Number 2, really, to only Ulysses S. Grant in Union lore, right? If you're of Southern sentiment, you're going to see this differently. But let me put my cards on the table. You're gonna hear things from my own point of view, which you should expect. But my own point of view is, I'm very pro-union, and I don't make any bones about it. I had 6 great-grandfathers that served in blue. You know, so my team won, is what I'm saying, and I'm not gonna let you forget it. So that's kind of the quick story of who this guy is. From here, let's muddy the waters a little bit. So Sherman was 9 years old when his father passed away. They were living on the frontier in Ohio. Now, of course, in the early 1800s, Ohio really was the frontier, right? He was a little redheaded urchin that loved to get into a lot of trouble, as I think many 9-year-old boys are apt to do. His father was a very prominent man. His father was a lawyer and became an Ohio Supreme Court justice. And he had an understanding that his father had this prominence, partly because his best friend was Thomas Ewing, another lawyer that traveled the circuit. Back then, lawyers and judges had to travel circuits of courts. They didn't serve at just one, you see. So his father was away from home a lot, but he was almost always traveling with his buddy Thomas Ewing, who lived right up the hill. Well, he learned one day, when his mother wasn't home suddenly, that his father was dying, and he never saw his father again. Well, this left the mother destitute. She had 9 children, and now she was a widow. She had no means of her own, and so she did what many people at the time did. She farmed out the children to various families in this pseudo-adoption scheme that wasn't really all that unusual at the time. And Sherman was adopted into the Ewing family. His father's best friend adopted one of the children. And the story is quite funny because he came to the house This was just a day after the burial. He came to the house and said to Sherman's mother, "I want the brightest of them." And Sherman's sister said, "Oh, you want Compy. You want Compy." Because that was their nickname for him, Comp or Compy. That's who you want. Well, Sherman had no problems with this because he was best friends with several of the Ewing boys. You know, they also had a large family. And so this was not terribly uncomfortable. He went to live with the Ewings. His mother lived just down the hill, so he could visit her anytime he wanted, right? But he would be raised and clothed and fed by the Ewings from that point on. And the Ewings loved him dearly, always treated him as a son. He was very well cared for. But it's a complex thing in some ways. Because children who lose their fathers at a young age, especially those that can remember their fathers a little bit, it seems to me there's always a little bit of strange kind of guilt to attach to a new father figure. You know what I'm talking about? There's always a little bit of awkwardness that's going to be there. It doesn't matter how close the relationship is, right? It's always going to be there. And so this was a thing. And so while Sherman always was gratified by the attention he was shown by the Ewings, he was always grateful to the Ewings so much, especially Thomas Ewing. But he also develops this kind of complex where at the same time he becomes a little bit resentful. A little bit resentful. And I'll give you a preview of why this is the case. So one of his playmates was a young girl named Ellen. And so Ellen was, I want to say 5 years old when Sherman moved into the big house. They had been playmates, they continued to be playmates. Now Sherman's going to go off to West Point when he's 16, I want to say. Later, the two will get married. So he will marry his adoptive sister and playmate as a child. Now, they're not biologically related, so that's not a problem, right? But there is a little bit of awkwardness there because it is his sister, right? Kinda. So there was always little concerns about just a slightly uncomfortable, incestuous, but not, right? People had to remind themselves, not. And the thing is Thomas Ewing, of course, saw his daughter as his daughter, not his daughter-in-law. He saw Sherman as his son more than he saw him as his son-in-law, right? And of course, he's kind of possessive of both. He is kind of, wants to be the father for both. And you cannot be all things to all people, as they say, right? And so Ellen had a particular attachment for her father and could never be far from home for very long at all. And so this affects their married life quite a bit. And that's where some of that resentment comes in. Because it's not like Thomas Ewing did anything to cause the resentment. It happens because of the unusual origins of this relationship. Does this make sense? Now, another factor that I'm going to come back on is religion. Now, the Shermans were Protestant. Devout, the mother especially devoutly. Mary Hoyt was her name, Sherman's mother. And one of the conditions, though, of Mrs. Ewing, Maria, was that Sherman be baptized in the Catholic Church and be raised Catholic in her home. Now, 9-year-old Sherman didn't have opinions about this at this point, really. And Mary Hoyt wasn't in a position to make demands, right? She knew he was going to be in a good home, so she went along with it. But this is going to be a very big thorn in the side of Sherman and this relationship, and we're going to talk more about that as we go. Now, I'm not trying, by the way, to do a definitive life history of Sherman here. What I'm really doing is laying out the complexities of his life and trying to talk about some of those moments that make this fascinating. I'm not going to go battle to battle to battle to battle, and some of you, I'm sure, are happy for that. I could do it if you want, but we'll be here until sometime tomorrow. So Sherman is the son of an up-and-coming man. So Thomas Ewing will find himself in short order a senator, a secretary of the Treasury, very prominent man in Washington. He has a lot of prominent friends, and we're talking about people like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and the big names of the time. Presidents came traipsing through the Ewing home, who young Sherman met before he went off to West Point. And so as Thomas Ewing is rising in the political ranks, Sherman gets pulled along into the arc and is meeting some very high-profile people and presidents even before he goes off to West Point. And it's not like it really gives him a big head or anything. He was always kind of humble about such things, but it did give him connections that he could draw on later, and that is kind of important, right? When he goes off to West Point, he's just not anybody now. When he goes off to West Point, he is the son of a prominent politician in Washington, which means that you're going to be handling young Sherman with kid gloves. Even if it's West Point and there is iron discipline, he's still young Ewing, right? And so that means something. Now Sherman, unlike Grant, Grant really was not thrilled at the West Point appointment, But Sherman, wanted to please Thomas Ewing, and so he just goes off on this as if it's just another lark, in an effort to please his dad/father-in-law someday. And he finds that he likes it, and it goes pretty well for him. He meets some really important people, people that will come to prominence during the Civil War. His closest friends were Confederates, or will be Confederates in a few years. Braxton Bragg, P.G.T. Beauregard, two prominent Confederate generals, James Longstreet. And he will meet Ulysses S. Grant, Sam, as they called him, at the point, though they were separated by several classes and didn't know each other well there. Sherman never was the sparkling cadet like a Robert E. Lee, who they say graduated with no demerits at all, the Virginia gentleman, partly because he could not dress the part. He was just kind of a slovenly dresser. And at West Point, man, you are judged by, how shiny your shoes are, and right? And so Sherman never could live up to that kind of standard, and he never becomes an officer. But he just kind of plugs away, and I think he graduated 6th in his class, so he didn't do too shabby, But it wasn't high enough to get him into the Corps of Engineers. And at that time, that was the elite of the American Army, the Corps of Engineers. And only the top 2 or top 3 are given an appointment, to the Corps of Engineers. That didn't really disappoint Sherman very much, because he never thought it was realistic anyway. And he ends up in infantry and artillery, and his first posting was down in Florida at the end of the Seminole Wars. And this goes well enough, but here's a point now where he is thinking again, who am I? Because now he's been cut loose from this academy where they ruled your life for the past 4 years, right? You had to live according to their schedule. You had to live according to their expectations. Meanwhile, he's carrying on a correspondence which is increasingly not passionate, but interesting with Ellen. Ellen isn't simply just the kid he used to play with anymore. They are more than pen pals. now, there's a sparking interest. And so when he rushes home, it's not to see his mom anymore. And so everybody at home starts to notice, no, maybe we're imagining things. They're not worried about it yet, but it's something that Sherman's thinking about. He's thinking about it. And he's wondering, is this the life for me? In the military, I'm far from Lancaster, Ohio, right? Here I am in Florida with just gators and mosquitoes, The weather's nice and the fishing is good, but I'm a long way from anything, But he does well enough. His next posting is to Fort Moultrie. Anybody know where Fort Moultrie is? South Carolina, Charleston, the cradle of secession, right? Or it will be the cradle of secession, fast becoming it by this point. And there he meets one of his most important friends, Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson, if you know the name, he is most famous for his defense of Fort Sumter at the beginning of the Civil War. He removed his men from Fort Moultrie out to Fort Sumter in the harbor because it was more easily defensible, and he is forced to surrender that to Confederate forces as the Civil War gets underway. Well, there at Fort Moultrie, they became fast friends. He was at the Anderson home a lot. Robert Anderson was an avid art collector, and that intrigued Sherman, and it was very pleasant. And so he spent a lot of his times making that attachment. Another thing he did while he was at Moultrie is also important. He was sent by the Inspector General down into Georgia. And this is largely about Seminole War legal claims. So he's sent to investigate some of these legal claims. It's minor duty, but it gets him out of the fort, gets him something interesting to do. But he doesn't know it at the time, but what he's really doing is doing an extended reconnaissance. Because he gets to know the landscape of north and central Georgia very, very well. He's got a photographic memory, and so, he remembers the topography of this land really well, the rivers and the direction that they flow and the rocks and all of this, which doesn't really mean much at the time. But later, during the Atlanta campaign in 1864, it's going to loom quite large because he remembers it all quite perfectly, or at least he claims to. It sure seems like he does to me. Now, life in the military, though, doesn't get him home very often. And so the longer he's in correspondence with Ellen, and the more serious the relationship becomes, this becomes something that, of course, looms larger in his mind, both for her and for him. She really doesn't want him to be in the military, which is going to cause increasing tension in this relationship. Thomas Ewing also wants his daughter to be happy. And Thomas Ewing, by this time, has a pretty good understanding of what's happening here between the two. He's not a dumb man. But he also thinks, Sherman can do better than the military. After all, here I'm in Washington, I got all these appointments, got some political power I can call in, Well, that becomes pretty apparent because when the Mexican War kicks off, this is the 1840s now, the war between Mexico and the United States, Sherman is itching, like many of these West Pointers, to get into the action. He wants to see combat. He wants to earn military glory. And one of the things I should say here at this point is Victorians, and so these are the middle class of America in the 19th century, they're the ones that make all the social rules, The Victorians lived their lives with rose-colored glasses on. This is a romantic period in American history. And so they romanticized everything, including war and death. And Sherman was not unaffected by this. He was not unaffected by this. He, like many of them, talked about, combat and war and death in these glowing romantic terms, like many of them did. And of course, as a young man with hot blood, off he wants to go. And so his friends are all called off to war, down to Mexico. And where is he assigned? But recruiting duty in Pittsburgh. Recruiting duty. Oh, he is not a happy man at all while his friends are going off to war, he's stuck on recruiting duty. And although the evidence doesn't demonstrate it very clearly, you gotta wonder if Thomas Ewing was keeping his future son-in-law away from where the bullets was flying. You know? And Sherman doesn't say it outright in anything that I've read, but you can if you read between the lines, he's probably wondering if he had anything to do with this, right? His daughter certainly did not want him where bullets was flying, right? Anyway, he does get called off to California, though. So he gets out of the recruiting duty, and he's called to California, and he thinks, all right, maybe I have a chance to get into this after all. You know, if the action spreads a little bit north, you know, we don't know where this is going to go just yet. So he's excited as hell to get on that boat and be on the boat for the next 8 months as he travels down the coast of North America, down the coast of South America, around the tip, back up the other side of South America before he finally lands in California, surviving 2 shipwrecks within 48 hours before he touches land. Not an auspicious beginning, right? And he arrives in California to find out that he's too late. It's all over. Oh, good. So he's stuck in California. California at this time is really rugged frontier. You know, nice weather, yeah, nice weather, but there's not a lot there yet, you know. And later he'll find himself during the gold rush. That'll make things a little bit more interesting. But that isn't until a little bit later. So Sherman is entirely miserable because he's missed his chance, you know? And he is a long way from home, and his romance is stalled. You know, yeah, he wanted it this way because he wanted his chance at glory, but now that that's out of the picture, now he's itching to get back home again. And boy, is Ellen pouring on the pressure for him to get out of the military. Really putting the pressure on. And of course, what that means is Thomas Ewing is doing the same thing, trying to get him appointments much closer to home, you know, which he's passing on because he's a soldier, and he kind of likes being a soldier despite the boredom, you know. Let's fast forward a few years for the sake of time. So he gets this offer out of the blue to be the president of a bank in California, which Ellen was very unhappy about. But on the other hand, she had been complaining for years that she wanted him out of the military. Well, this would mean he was out of the military, and it's a very prominent, well-paying gig, you know, president of a bank. And it's actually president of a bank at a pretty good time. California is rising, the population is increasing steadily, San Francisco is quickly becoming a money market on the West Coast, you know? And so he's attracted by this for all of these reasons. He accepts the job, he resigns from the Army, and he does quite well as a bank president in San Francisco, quite well. But what Ellen had been hoping for is just one of those things where you got to remind yourself, be careful what you wish for, right? Because it might not come in the form that you want it to, right? There is a passage in here, if I can find it. That's not the one I wanted. Just give me a second here. You know, I feel this desire to actually read from my book once in a while. You know, but you know what? I guess I don't have to. You guys have already bought the book and had me sign it. No, I don't need to sign it. I don't sell any books now. You already bought it. Good night. So he does so well, right? But his wife, Ellen, comes to California so grudgingly, and we know now one of the interesting parts of the story is she leaves Minnie, the daughter, the youngest daughter, with her father and her mother back in Lancaster, Ohio. Sherman doesn't know about this until his wife shows up, and it sounds an awful like it was a blackmail demand by the parents. You know, well, if you have to go off, you're going to have to leave one of your kids with us. And Sherman was furious, as you might imagine, that you know, his wife was strong-armed into leaving the youngest daughter in Lancaster, Ohio, and he's not going to see her for years now. You know, it's just an indication of the complexity of this relationship within this family, right? And one of those reasons why that resentment once in a while rears its head. Well, things in California don't go entirely according to plan. One of the interesting things is the gold rush. And the gold rush, of course, is one of those people where, you know, people see money flashing before their eyes and they do crazy things in the name of making a ton of money fast, right? But I'll tell you something about Sherman's character that I find fascinating. In his off hours, you didn't find him out there panhandling, even though he was close and he could have done it at any time he wanted, and the gold fever was on everybody. You know what he did instead? He opened a general store to cater to the needs of the miners who needed stuff. They needed pen and supplies, and they needed food supplies. Very smart. And he makes a ton of money on this just in 1 year's time. Very smart. Looking ahead, you know, looking ahead. The bank eventually closes, not because of anything he's done wrong, but just because of the economies of scale and the inflation beginning to set in and things like this. And so the bank closes and back east he goes. Now he's looking around for something to do, and he feels kind of like a failure. Even though he had done really well for himself, and the bank branch, you know, didn't collapse or anything, it's just the partners decided to close that branch, he still feels like a failure because now he's out of work again, you know. He's got some savings and he can live with the Ewings. They would be happy for that scenario. But you know, this identity thing is really important to him. He wants to be his own man. He does not want to be Ewing Jr., you know, owing his jobs to his father-in-law. You know, by this time, of course, the Shermans are married. And so he's strongly fighting against all the suggestions made by the Ewings because he wants to do it on his own. He wants to be his own man. He wants to figure out his own gig. But the problem is he had to do something in the meantime, so he ends up in Leavenworth, Kansas, where two of his brother-in-laws have a law office, partly funded by Thomas Ewing. There's a Ewing business nearby, and he's miserable. You know, he does become a lawyer. He gets admitted at the bar. But again, being admitted at the bar in those days wasn't like you had to go through law school or anything, right? I'm the son of Thomas Ewing. Oh, you're admitted, sir. Come in. It was not that hard. Though those legal skills will come in kind of handy a little bit later. It's there that in a most unlikely opportunity is presented to him to be the superintendent of a new military academy in Louisiana, not far from Baton Rouge in Alexandria. The state of Louisiana wants this new military academy for their up-and-coming teenager boys, and part of the reason is secession fever is starting to loom large, and Louisiana wants to be ready. So here's an interesting thing. So Sherman, who misses the military, is drawn to the opportunity. Sherman, the Union man, can see that this is kind of problematic because you are training potential enemies, right? He doesn't think at this point that war will really happen, so that's not a big part of his thinking just yet. Of course, the South was threatening secession kind of frequently, but I'm not sure at that point he really thought it was going to happen. You know what I mean? So his friend P.G.T. Beauregard, again, a man that will become a prominent Confederate general, helps to get him the job. His other reference was Braxton Bragg, and they get him this gig at the Louisiana seminary and military academy in Alexandria, Louisiana. He is just thrilled as can be because he did it on his own, well, with the references from his rebel buddies, but he did it on his own, and he goes to Louisiana, even though it is 1860, and, you know, the dark clouds are already rolling in, you know. And so he gets it all started very expertly. He's a great administrator. He gets the whole thing underway. They open the academy to a small class at first, and then that fall, the presidential election of 1860 is going to come off while he's living in the midst of all of these folks in Louisiana. And there are some awkward moments here, some really awkward moments, as you probably can well imagine. And here I do think I can find the secession crisis. Sherman was dining with Professor Boyd, professor of mathematics, when news arrived that South Carolina had seceded. This is after the election of Abraham Lincoln and the election of 1860. Sherman began pacing the floor, tears falling, his tongue flinging despair, his friend Boyd recalled. The transplanted Ohioan turned to his friend and lashed out, You, the people of the South, believe there can be such a thing as peaceable secession. You don't know what you're doing. No, there can be no such thing. If you will have it, the North must fight for its own preservation. Yes, South Carolina has by this act precipitated war. His country will be drenched in blood. It's all folly, madness, crime against civilization. Sherman saw that he would have to leave Louisiana and go north. But to what? Once again, he'd be adrift. War seemed inevitable. You people speak so lightly of war, he lashed out. You don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing. And you mistake, too. People of the North, they're a peaceable people, but an earnest people, and will fight, too. They're not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. You are bound to fail. Only in your spirit and determination are you prepared for war. In all else, you're totally unprepared and with a bad cause to start with. Awaiting the secession of Louisiana amounted to torture for Sherman as he sat powerless to alter the course of the state. As, of course, Louisiana does secede in short order, and he says he's honor-bound now to resign. Many tears flowed, not only for himself, but his plebes. I guess there was a very moving ceremony, and Sherman was so choked up he couldn't even speak. He just whispered, "You're all here. You're all here." Turned his back and had to leave. So he goes north to Washington. Now, another political connection that I haven't told you about is by this time his brother is a United States Senator. He'd been a congressman from Ohio. An opening ends up just by accident throwing his brother into the United States Senate at the very beginning of the Civil War. Prominent Republican, powerful, on powerful committees. So another connection, right? So he's got Thomas Ewing, that is his father-in-law, adopted father, prominent, powerful politician now, his brother, a powerful senator. And he goes to Washington, and he's ushered in to meet the President of the United States without even an appointment. And it doesn't go well. He is so unimpressed with Lincoln that Sherman just storms out and tells his brother, "You guys, get us out of this mess the best that you can. I'm going home." And leaves. Goes back to Ohio. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he goes back to Ohio. And he is really adrift because he's torn, right? The Union has its greatest crisis ever, and here he is on the sidelines by choice, because while he was there, he was offered brigadier stars, which he passed up, because he, again, didn't want it coming at the bidding of his brother. He's a very independent man, right? He wants to do it on his own, but he wants it on his terms. He wants it on his terms. Because at the very beginning of the Civil War, the Union was can't use the words that I would like to use here in mixed company. It was ugly. The beginning of the Civil War was really ugly, very unorganized. It didn't look like anybody knew what they were doing here, right? And Sherman can see this in an instant and said, you know what, I don't want anything to do with this. So he goes back, and he is in St. Louis, because, again, he doesn't know what to do with himself, so he's kind of wandering, when his former partners from the bank offer him a job as the president of a streetcar company in St. Louis. And he's like, well, I got nothing better to do, you know, and so he takes that for want of anything else. And meanwhile, the wires from Washington, from his brother in particular, but also the father-in-law, are just incessant. Because they wanted him out of the military before, but as it turns out, the Ewings want him in the military now, you know. And so the pressure just builds and builds. And he keeps passing on every offer that comes along. He just keeps passing on them. And they're like, what are you doing? You're giving up a brigadier's stars, which could mean permanency in the army, right? What are you doing? But he wants it on his terms. And finally it does come. As it turns out, what he was waiting for was a job with the regulars, because he wanted to be a colonel. He didn't want to be a general out of the gate because he wanted to earn his star, you see. But he also was very hesitant about commanding volunteers, men who had never been in the service before. They're doing it for the first time. You're going to have to train them. They're all going to be green, right? He wants to work with regulars. And so he finally gets his wish, colonel of a regiment of regulars. He goes to Washington thinking, all right, I've got what I wanted now. This is going to make everybody happy. And there is no regiment. It's not there. It hasn't been even recruited yet. So he finds he's got nothing to do. So he becomes an unofficial aide-de-camp to Winfield Scott. So again, here he's drifting, right? He thought he had something. Turns out it's an illusion. It'll come eventually. No, it's a mess. He ends up in the first battle of the war, the Battle of Bull Run, which is an absolute disaster for the Union Army. Doesn't start out that way, but it turns into a Union rout. And the Union Army goes scampering. The rebels, of course, are thrilled and celebrating. And the Union Army is in full embarrassing retreat back into Washington. Sherman at least kept his regiment in hand and did pretty well when everybody else just dropped their guns and ran. And so he comes out of it looking okay, and actually he's going to get a promotion to brigadier unbidden, you know, largely because a lot of other guys are going to get fired or got killed, and just there's openings now. And so he doesn't know anything about it until it's already happened, and so he's got no opportunity to protest, and there he is, brigadier. When his old friend Robert Anderson calls, Robert Anderson now has been placed in Kentucky. Kentucky at this point really was not either in the Union column or in the Confederate column. But Robert Anderson, his buddy, says, listen, I want you to be my second in command. Would you come out to Kentucky? And Sherman has seen enough of Washington and the environments. He hates politicians, you know, with a passion. And so he thinks, you know what? This gets me away from Washington and this stupid environment, and off to Kentucky he goes. But he makes it very clear before he goes, under no circumstances am I to get promoted to command of this department. At this point in his career, he does not want command. He just does not want it. A regiment is one thing. Command of a whole department, apparently he didn't feel up to, you know. He's kind of feeling his way here. Again, who is he? What's realistic? What are his abilities? Which, after all, are kind of unproven still, you know. Well, Robert Anderson doesn't last long. The 56-year-old hero of Fort Sumter really wasn't physically up to it from the very beginning. One of the reasons he called Sherman to him. He secretly had this plan all along where if his health broke, his boy Sherman would be there to take over. Again, he didn't tell Sherman, so Sherman didn't see it coming. So Anderson partly because of physical ailments, but partly because of the stress of being in this very awkward position in Kentucky, resigns. He actually retires at age 56 from the military, leaving Sherman in charge of the department. And this was just a terrible mess. It was a terrible mess because he didn't have nearly the men he needed to defend his department. He didn't have the guns that he needed to even have all of the soldiers he had with guns. And it seemed like the politicians in Washington only cared about the East. Now, to be fair, at this point, they all kind of thought this was going to be a short, bloodless war still, and that the war is not really going to spread into the West, and so they weren't paying much attention at all. But meanwhile, there is a substantial Confederate army, or it seems to be a substantial Confederate army, which is a different thing. But whether they had the numbers that they boasted, in reality they had less than a third of the numbers they were boasting they had. They did have a very known commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, who was probably, as this war started, the #1 general in the South in reputation. Robert E. Lee had not come to the fore yet, and so Albert Sidney Johnston seemed to be their #1 guy. And so not only are you seemingly facing this host, this Confederate host, but also you've got the #1 general in the South at your doorstep, seemingly. And this had Sherman really on edge. And so this is the Kentucky episode I was telling you about earlier, where he comes under a lot of pressure and comes a little bit unglued, and he gets into a meeting with the Secretary of War. Now, at this time, the Secretary of War was Simon Cameron, former governor of Pennsylvania. Some would say a crook. I would agree with that assessment myself, but he was not an efficient man either. And he had a lot of journalist friends that he always had in tow. And there were a lot of leaks from the War Department, so now we know where a lot of these leaks came from. Anyway, Secretary of War is on his way to investigate another problem when Sherman pigeonholes him and has this closed-door conversation with him and 3 other guys. And Sherman's like, well, can we just, you and I talk? No, you can trust these people. You can trust these are my boys, All journalists, as it turned out, And so to the Secretary of War, he thinks he's laying out a realistic situation. He doesn't know that this is going to end up in the press later. And the other thing is he was so prophetic because everything Sherman said to the Secretary of War at that moment turns out to be not just true, but underestimating what it will eventually take to subdue the Mississippi River Valley. So he was talking about how it would take hundreds of thousands of men and all of these casualties, right? And to the Secretaries of War, it's like, well, where would I get those kind of men? And no, and the journalist thought he was mad because he was seemingly a little bit panicky. He was throwing out these huge numbers, which, as I said, later proved to be all too accurate. But at the time, it made him look kind of crazy, a little unhinged and panicky. And, of course, what happens next, you can predict with a bunch of journalists that heard all of this. And Simon Cameron, of course, running his mouth afterwards, it made for a pretty ugly situation. So... Satisfied that his meeting with Cameron had impressed the gravity of the situation in Kentucky, Sherman had, in fact, overdone it. The overly dramatic, even shocking assertions only served to inspire wonder in those present, including several reporters unbeknownst to Sherman, as to the mental soundness of the general. Later, in a letter to the Adjutant General, Sherman lamented, "It would be better if someone more sanguine of mind were here." In early November, Sherman found in the New York Tribune, dated October 30th, a very unflattering account of his meeting with Cameron contained in a report by the Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas. Omitting Sherman's request for 60,000 men for defense, the report instead focused on Sherman's estimate of 200,000 troops for offensive operations. Angry, the Ohio-born general fired off a retort to Thomas. "Do not conclude," he said, "that I exaggerate the facts. They are as stated, and the future looks as dark as possible." Finally, on November 8th, Sherman asked to be relieved. Ordered to report in person to Major General Henry Halleck for duty in St. Louis, Sherman might have felt some relief from being unburdened from command. Then in late November, he received a message from headquarters that began, "Mrs. Sherman is here." He was being sent home. Halleck had seen enough. "I'm satisfied that General Sherman's physical and mental system is so completely broken by labor and care as to render him, for the present, entirely unfit for duty. It would be dangerous to give him a command here." Back in Lancaster, just as Sherman showed signs of recovery, the headline, "General William T. Sherman Insane," appeared in the Cincinnati Commercial. The allegations presented in support of the headline included frequently unhinged appeals to Washington, overestimated strength of the enemy, giving up Cumberland Gap, issuing orders incredulous to his subordinates. He was, in their words, stark mad. McClellan will say, "Sherman's gone in the head." Imagine the humiliation, because this is your home state newspaper, the Commercial, right? And other Ohio newspapers take it up. What in the world happened here? What in the world happened here? Well, part of it is that you're going to probably need a hook for me. Do I have a hard time limit?
Not necessarily, but
But
You see us going like
will you give me 15 minutes?
you got it.
Thank you. All right, I do want to talk about this, and then I can get through the war pretty quickly. And I have a quick summary I can do. This is my first talk about the book, and so how much I can cover and how much time, is a thing I'm still figuring out. To do part 2, I'd be happy to. All right, so let me talk about this insanity thing, because it's central to the reputation of Sherman, right? So what really happened here? He wasn't insane, clearly, because he, of course, goes on to be a hero of the Republic. Let's think about this. First of all, his personality is involved. Sherman was intense. Sherman was a talkaholic. Sherman was always fidgety and nervous, even when everything was calm. And he smoked 20 to 30 cigars a day.
Oh,
So the nicotine load on this guy must have been incredible,
Cigars.
right? And the anxiety of what he feels is happening here must have been pretty intense. Remember, we know how the story ends, right? But did they know this early in the war, how this was going to turn out? And so the pressure had to have been enormous. And one prominent historian has suggested something called adjustment disorder. You'll read about it in the book that you've already bought, I'm certain. But it's really an interesting theory, because other theories make less sense to me. Adjustment disorder. Well, what really is the key to turning Sherman around is Grant. He becomes friends with Ulysses S. Grant increasingly. The Battle of Shiloh, the Vicksburg campaign in 1863, the men grow closer and closer and closer, despite the fact that one is kind of reclusive and quiet and reserved and, very calm, And on the other hand, Sherman is, as I said, just, one historian called him Daffy Duck with a machine gun mouth. And so this pair work well together. And Sherman finds himself largely as a result of new confidence earned in this partnership and friendship with Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant can see Sherman's worth when everybody else could not. And that gave him confidence. And in confidence, you are bolder, right? And so this is kind of the story of the war in a nutshell. He takes on more and more responsibility. He becomes a hero in the Atlanta campaign. He captures Atlanta in 1864. He marches to the sea late in 1864. All of these a stunning success and independent command. Grant is off in Virginia. Sherman's doing this on his own, with his own commanders. He was one of the first to command what we would call an army group. On the Atlanta campaign, there were 3 armies serving under him. Not one that he was in command of, 3 independent armies under his command. All of this is kind of setting in motion very important examples that will be in use in World War I, including things like trench warfare and army groupings and some of these tactics. Even though historians have been pretty hard on Sherman and has said that he's not tactically a very good general. He avoids battle a lot. He's not like Grant that just seeks out to hammer and hammer and hammer. He tries to win through maneuver. But you know what? It works. It still works, right? And they win. And he, again, is the number 2 hero of the war. Now, his life after the war isn't very happy. You know, now that the war is over and he's earned his glory and his moment has passed, it's hard to relive that glory, right? And like many of his soldiers going home, this was the high point of their life. How are they ever going to have the same excitement again, right? And so he spends the rest of his life trying to regain the glory he earned in war, and he spends a lot of time visiting reunions, veterans reunions, because of course there his boys rally around him and they sing to him, and he's the hero again in their eyes, right? And he gets the kind of reception that he misses. In Washington, his reception, even though he's the general of the army when Grant becomes president, isn't happy at all. He finds that Grant becomes a politician, which he's very disappointed in. And probably one of the lowest parts of his life was a crisis in his family. And this is kind of a 2-part crisis. First, his father-in-law dies, Thomas Ewing, and the funeral was very Catholic. And shortly thereafter, his son, Thomas, joins the Jesuit order to be ordained a priest in the Jesuit order. And Sherman is so upset about this. He blames his wife, Ellen. They don't speak for almost 2 years. They don't live together during this time at all. He can't hardly look at her. He blames her for encouraging their son to become this Jesuit priest. And he's talking about his son being dead to him. He's talking about very close to suicide, though not quite in that blatant language. And again, it casts him down into this identity crisis of sorts, right? Am I a good father? My son did this despite me, right? And the whole thing, right? Loving and resenting the father-in-law. And Ellen really poured on the religious pressure after her father died. Really put a lot of pressure on him to become fully Catholic, come fully into the... He was agnostic. He wanted no part of this. No part of this. And so the last years of the lives of Ellen and William Tecumseh Sherman are just really not happy ones. You know, he tries to live by escaping. He goes to the theater a lot. He travels a lot and spends very little time with Ellen. She passes away before him, and he lives a handful more years, dies in New York City on Valentine's Day, 1891, I want to say. So that is the story of William Tecumseh Sherman. I'm sorry I went over my time limit so badly. I'd be happy to take any questions.
As a Southerner, and of course, Sherman was the gentleman that burned his way through Atlanta and marched across.
That's Gone with the Wind talking.
Yeah, that was our problem back then. That was going on. But yeah, we were getting obviously a very sanitized Southern patriotic viewpoint of the war. So it was very impressive presentation.
Thank you very much. He returns to Atlanta after the war and gets a surprisingly warm reception. And I'm not talking about torches, in his honor. He gets a surprisingly warm reception in Atlanta.
Okay.
Well, by then, the reconciliation movement is in full flight, And some of this has to do with a new narrative that we refer to now as the lost cause myth, that is being forwarded by a handful of Confederates, including Jubal Early. This is after the death of Robert E. Lee. And so they're trying to construct a narrative that makes them appear to win despite they lost. Does that make sense? Other questions? Over here first.
How many children ultimately did they have?
How many what?
How many children ultimately did they have?
Did Sherman and Ellen have? 7, I want to say. I think 7.
Lineage still around?
What's that?
Is the lineage still?
Yes. Yes, I believe so. One story I did not tell you is his son Willie died during the war, not long after the Vicksburg campaign. And that was another one of those crisis moments for him. But he didn't have enough time. He didn't have enough time to grieve in the moment because there was a new emergency. And that unsolved grieving, I think, is a factor later in the crisis when Thomas joins the Jesuits. That's just an argument that I would make. Dean.
Wasn't he asked to run for president?
Oh, yes.
And so my question is, when he refused, did he refuse because he felt he wasn't up to it, or did he say tell his nose to the politicians? Or
No. The reason that he refused is because he saw what his friend Grant went through. How his friend became a politician and then they used him. Because Grant went into the presidency very naive. Very naive. He wasn't a politician, And the Republicans said to Grant, look, you get to live in a big white house, you're going to eat really well. We'll do all the work, you just need to sign a few papers once in a while. We'll do all the work, just trust us. Trust us. Well, he did.
and then the corruption resides.
Yeah. So after having seen what happened to Grant, there was no way that was going to happen. There's a very famous quote that came out of that. Let's see. If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. Yeah. Yes?
The brothers-in-law that you followed down to work with, did they stay in the South or did they move back with the Union?
His brothers-in-law?
Yeah.
So the Shermans owned a salt works in Kansas. They stayed in the family for a little while. And I don't actually know how long he remained in the family. Now, many of his brothers-in-law, former playmates of the Ewings, joined the Union Army. Some of them served under Sherman in the Army, which caused even more tension because the Ewings always wanted them promoted. The promotion was at Sherman's, in his power, but they hadn't earned it. And so he's got this tension, right?
The father coach.
This is a mess. Have you gotten this?
Yeah.
This is, all of this is a mess. It's fascinating. All right. Ryan, I'm done.
All right.
See, Ryan knows I can have you here all night.
Well, thank you again, Derek. It was very enlightening.
That was very tactful, huh?
I'm trying to be that diplomatic person the whole time. So, but I want to thank you all for coming out. Just a quick update on upcoming things. Our next event is next Thursday, where we're doing our next trivia night. It's on Thomas Jefferson. Another one of those very ambiguous sort of historical figures that we're going to talk about. So,
Can I talk about him now?
You might ruin all the questions I've come up with. So, I worked very hard on those.
I was going to say, you shouldn't let him attend. He'll
Yeah.
smoke everyone.
Well, It's all about having fun. So, so that's at 7 o'clock next Thursday. Then our next guest speaker will be 2 weeks from tonight. Rick Felkowski will be coming. He is a Buffalo area historian, and he wrote a couple volumes on historical figures of Buffalo and West New York. So he'll be doing talking about the first volume, which has a lot of figures recognizable to this place. So that'll be very interesting. Again at 7 o'clock. And let's see. We have a concert with Steve Kruppner. We'll be doing an acoustic guitar show here on the 20th, so the day after the guest speaker. And then our next Java with Joe is with Larry Barnes, who's here tonight. So we'll be talking about his travels to the many Batavias of the United States. So 8, yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we've been going back and forth counting them up. So so that'll be Thursday the 27th at 9 a.m. So if anybody's interested, and I think everybody's filled out their form, but for anybody who hasn't, it's always a good time to become a member or convince some other of your friends to become members, and then you can see them all at these events that we put on. So thank you all, and I know Derek, if he hasn't signed a book for you, he'll be happy to do that, and have some more cookies and coffee, because I don't need them.
Thank you.